Happy birthday, Elena. I brought you something you never expected.
What is this?
Your divorce papers.
You chose my birthday to leave me?
It's over, Elena. Sign the papers.
On my birthday?
I thought you'd be grateful for the freedom.
Husband gave his wife divorce papers as a birthday gift. He never expected what happened next. Julian Hale thought a birthday breakfast was the perfect place to end his marriage. He had no idea he was about to hand his wife the only piece of leverage she would ever need. Hit subscribe if you believe no man should ever hand his wife divorce papers as a birthday gift. Only cheaters, cowards, and Julian Hale sympathizers will scroll past without subscribing. You've been warned. Camille Reyes had spent 10 years learning the difference between a compliment and a countdown, and Julian Hale had never once realized she was keeping score. It started small, the way most disasters do, disguised as convenience. Julian liked his coffee at exactly 7:15. He liked his shirts pressed with military creases and his opinions delivered without interruption. Camille had once found that discipline attractive, back when she still believed control was just another word for care. 10 years later, she understood the difference the way a person understands the difference between a seatbelt and a straitjacket. Both hold you in place. Only one of them is trying to save your life. On the morning of her 32nd birthday, Atlanta was doing its usual impression of a postcard, golden light spilling over the kitchen counter where Camille stood in her robe, hair still damp, humming something she couldn't quite name. Julian entered fully dressed, suit pressed, tie knotted with surgical precision, holding a silver-wrapped box like a man about to be knighted for good behavior. "Happy birthday," he said, setting it in front of her with the ceremony of a man unveiling a car on a game show. Camille smiled despite herself. 10 years of marriage teaches you to hope even when hope has stopped paying rent in your chest. She untied the ribbon slowly, savoring it, because some small foolish part of her still wanted this to be the morning he remembered who she used to be to him. Inside the box sat a plain, white envelope. For a moment she assumed it was tickets.
Paris, maybe.
He had promised Paris for their 5th anniversary and delivered a blender instead, a story she had long since turned into a joke at dinner parties to keep herself from crying about it in public. She opened the envelope. Divorce papers, crisp, notarized, terrifyingly official, sat in her hands like a verdict she hadn't known she was on trial for. "I want a clean start," Julian said, using the tone he usually reserved for quarterly budget meetings. "I thought doing it today would make things simple. Get it over with before the day gets emotional." Camille looked up at him, waiting for the punchline. It did not arrive. Julian Hale, $60,000 watch on his wrist, a man who alphabetized his liquor cabinet and ironed his socks, had just informed his wife over orange juice that her marriage was being terminated effective immediately, and he genuinely believed this qualified as considerate timing. She did not cry. She did not throw the plate, although her hand did drift toward it with what could only be described as professional interest. Instead, she asked one question, quiet, level, almost gentle. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" Julian straightened his tie, mistaking her calm for defeat. "Yes," he said.
I've made up my mind.
This is happening. What Julian did not know, could not know, was that 3 days earlier Camille had picked up his phone to silence a notification and found an email thread that had rearranged every assumption she'd ever made about her marriage. A woman named Priya, an apartment lease in Buckhead, a wedding venue deposit, paid in full, dated for a ceremony 6 months from now, timed to the week his divorce would supposedly be finalized. Julian wasn't just leaving his wife. He was leaving with his spreadsheet already open in a new tab. She had said nothing. Camille had built her career reading rooms full of men who thought their silence was strategy, and she had learned long ago that the person who speaks first in a negotiation is usually the one who loses it. So instead of arguing, instead of begging the way Julian had clearly rehearsed for in the mirror, Camille closed the envelope, set it gently on the counter, and said 5 words that made her husband's confident smile falter for the first time that morning. "I'll need until tonight." Julian blinked. "That's it? No scene? No tears?" Camille tied her robe a little tighter, the picture of composure. "Tears are for women who didn't see it coming," she said. Give me until tonight, Julian. I have somewhere to be first. She walked past him toward the stairs, leaving him standing in the kitchen holding a silver ribbon and the sudden, uncomfortable suspicion that he had just made the biggest miscalculation of his very organized life. By nightfall, on a rain-slicked runway across town, Julian would learn exactly how right he was. The rest of that birthday unfolded like a countdown Julian didn't know he'd started. Camille spent the morning doing something Julian would have found deeply unremarkable had he bothered to ask, which he did not, because men like Julian rarely ask questions they've already decided they know the answers to. She made 3 phone calls. She met with a woman named Odalise Ferreira, a sharp-eyed attorney with a corner office and a reputation for representing wives who arrived quiet and left rich. She reviewed documents Julian assumed were buried too deep for her to find. The way men who hide things always assume the hiding spot is the hard part. It wasn't. The hard part was deciding what to do with what she found. Julian, meanwhile, spent his day the way a man spends a day when he believes the worst of it is already behind him. He went to work. He took a congratulatory call from a business partner about a shipping deal closing that evening. He did not, at any point, consider that his wife might be doing anything other than crying into a pillow somewhere, because in Julian's mental model of Camille, tears were her only available setting. This was, historically, his biggest miscalculation. Camille Reyes had grown up the daughter of a woman who ran a restaurant through 2 recessions and a hurricane without ever once raising her voice, and she had inherited exactly one thing from her: the ability to smile through a crisis while quietly rearranging the furniture behind her back. By 6 that evening, Julian's business partner had arranged a small celebratory send-off at a private airfield outside the city, where a jet was fueling up for an overnight trip to close the shipping deal Julian had been chasing for 2 years, a deal that, unbeknownst to him, hinged on financing he did not fully control. Camille arrived at that same airfield 40 minutes later, suitcase in hand, hair damp from rain that had started sometime around dusk and hadn't bothered to stop since. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. If you found out the person who claimed to want a clean start had actually been building an entirely different life behind your back for months, would you confront him immediately, or would you let him walk further out onto the ledge first? Comment below, because Camille's answer might surprise you, and only people who've never been blindsided by someone they trusted will scroll past without weighing in. Julian spotted her near the tarmac and felt something in his chest do an uncomfortable little flip. The sensation of a man realizing his plan has developed a subplot he didn't approve. He'd expected her to be home, packing quietly, maybe calling her sister to cry about how unfair he was. He had not expected her standing 30 feet from his jet in a black dress, mascara tracking rain down her cheeks like war paint that had gotten emotional. "You said tonight," she called out over the wind, holding up the envelope, still unsigned. "I'm here." Julian crossed the tarmac toward her, equal parts relieved and unsettled, the way a man feels when a negotiation goes exactly as planned right up until it doesn't. "This isn't where I expected to do this," he said. "Nothing about tonight is where anyone expected it to happen," Camille said, and there was something in her voice now, something calm and dangerous, like the stillness right before a storm decides to stop being polite about it. Julian reached for the envelope.
"Sign it here," he said.
"Let's just be done." Camille didn't hand it over. Instead, she turned it slowly in her hands, studying it the way you'd study a losing lottery ticket you weren't quite ready to throw away yet. "Before I sign anything," she said, "there's someone I think you should meet." Julian frowned, confusion flickering across a face that had spent all day being certain of things.
"Meet who?" he said.
"There's no one here." That was when the jet door at the far end of the tarmac hissed open, stairs unfolding with mechanical patience, warm light spilling out onto the wet concrete like the opening of a door Julian had never known existed in his own life. A man stepped out, tall, tattooed, unhurried, dressed in a suit that fit the way expensive things fit, quietly and without apology. Julian felt the temperature of the evening drop several degrees, though the weather app on his phone would have insisted nothing had changed. "Who?" he started to ask and then stopped, because some part of him, the same part that had ironed socks and alphabetized bottles his whole adult life without ever once reading the room, finally understood that he had badly miscalculated. The man who descended the jet stairs moved like someone who had never once needed to hurry to prove a point. Rain caught in the light spilling from the cabin door, and for a moment Julian had the strange, dislocating sensation of watching a scene from a film he hadn't agreed to be cast in. "Camille," he said, ignoring Julian entirely, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "You're late." "Traffic," Camille said, and something in the way she said it, easy, familiar, suggested this was not their first conversation. Julian's mouth had gone dry in a way no amount of quarterly meetings had ever prepared him for. "Who is this?" he asked, and hated himself immediately for how thin his voice sounded against the rain. Camille turned to him, unhurried, the envelope still dangling from 2 fingers like a question she hadn't decided whether to answer yet. "This is Ryu Taehyun," she said. "He owns Halcyon Pacific Shipping. You might recognize the name. You've been borrowing against it for 2 years." Julian felt the ground tilt slightly beneath his very expensive shoes. He started, "That's confidential." "That's not, how would you even?" "I read things," Camille said. "That's what I do while you're busy alphabetizing Jin. I read contracts. I read emails. I read a very interesting lease agreement for an apartment in Buckhead with a woman named Priya, and a deposit for a wedding venue dated for exactly 6 months from now, which is an ambitious timeline for a man who apparently just decided this morning that our marriage was over." The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind that presses on your ears before a storm breaks. Julian's face cycled through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, denial, and finally something closer to panic, the particular panic of a man watching every carefully organized shelf of his life get swept onto the floor at once. "That's not," he said, and stopped, because there was no version of that sentence that ended anywhere good. Ryu finally turned his attention to Julian, and it was somehow worse than being ignored. His gaze had the unhurried patience of a man who had spent a career waiting for people to finish being wrong before correcting them. "You handed her divorce papers as a birthday gift," Ryu said, tilting his head slightly, as if turning the idea over to inspect it from a more forgiving angle and finding none. "Bold. I'll give you that. Also remarkably foolish, considering the financing on your shipping deal closes through my company tonight, and I do not do business with men who treat their wives like liabilities to be filed." Julian's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out of it. "You don't understand," he managed finally. "This is between me and Camille. This has nothing to do with the deal." Camille laughed, short and sharp, the sound cutting cleanly through the rain. "Everything is connected, Julian," she said. "That's the part you never bothered to learn. You thought you could hide the loan from me, because I don't check the accounts. You thought you could hide Priya, because I'm too busy hosting your business dinners to notice the calendar invites. You thought handing me papers over breakfast would be simple because you assumed I'd cry and sign and disappear quietly, the way I've disappeared quietly for 10 years, so you could feel important. If you're watching this and you've ever shrunk yourself to make someone else feel bigger, you already know exactly what this moment cost her, and exactly what it's about to cost him. Drop a comment if you've been there, because only people who've never been underestimated will scroll past without saying so." Julian took a step forward, reaching for the envelope again, his voice climbing towards something desperate. "Camille, let's talk about this like adults. Not out here. Not in front of," he gestured vaguely at Ryu, "whoever this is." "Ryu is my business partner," Camille said, and watched with something close to satisfaction as the words landed. "Has been for 8 months. Halcyon Pacific financed the consulting firm I started after you told me my business idea was, and I quote, a cute hobby that wouldn't survive its first tax season." Julian's expression suggested he was recalculating several years of assumptions in real time and not enjoying a single figure. "You're a partner," he said slowly, as though the words tasted unfamiliar in his mouth. "In a shipping company." "In several companies," Camille said. "Turns out I'm better at reading contracts than you gave me credit for. Turns out I'm better at a lot of things you never bothered to notice, because you were too busy deciding I was simple." Ryu checked his watch, unbothered by the storm gathering both overhead and across Julian's face. "We should board," he said to Camille. "The financing call is in 20 minutes, and I'd like you in the room for it." Camille nodded, then turned back to Julian one final time, holding up the still and signed envelope. "You asked me this morning if I was certain I'd sign," she said. "I'm not certain of much right now, Julian, except this. You handed me an envelope thinking it would end something. Instead, you handed me exactly what I needed to begin something. I'll have my attorney send this back to you," she said, tucking it into her bag, "once I've decided how much of your shipping deal you actually get to keep." She turned, suitcase wheels catching against wet concrete, and walked toward the stairs of the jet without looking back, leaving Julian standing alone on the tarmac in the rain, finally, painfully understanding that the woman he'd spent 10 years underestimating had just closed the door on more than their marriage. The jet's cabin was warm in a way the tarmac had refused to be, all soft leather and quiet hums, and Camille sank into her seat feeling the adrenaline of the last hour finally start to loosen its grip on her spine. Ryu settled across from her, already scrolling through something on a tablet, unbothered, the way men who own airfields tend to be unbothered by most things. "You didn't have to do that," Camille said. "The whole entrance. The tattoos and menace routine." Ryu glanced up, the ghost of a smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. "I didn't do a routine," he said. "I simply exist, and your husband is the sort of man who assigns menace to anyone he can't immediately categorize. That's not theater. That's just him being predictable." Camille laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her, the first genuinely light thing she'd felt all day. Outside the window, the tarmac lights blurred as the jet began to taxi, Atlantis shrinking into a smear of gold and wet asphalt behind them. But Julian was not done being predictable, and predictability, as Camille was about to learn, had a way of curdling into something more dangerous when a man realized he was losing. He had gotten into his car the moment the jet doors sealed shut, hands trembling slightly on the wheel, not from the cold. His phone was already at his ear, dialing his attorney with the frantic energy of a man trying to unring a bell he'd swung with both hands. "Freeze the accounts," he said, the second the call connected. "All of them. Tonight. I don't care what time it is." There was a pause on the other end, the tinny sound of his attorney clearing his throat with the particular reluctance of a man about to deliver bad news to someone who did not tolerate bad news gracefully. "Julian," his attorney said carefully, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react the way I know you're about to react." Julian's jaw tightened.
"What?"
"Camille restructured your joint accounts 11 days ago. Legally. She had power of attorney from the refinancing paperwork you signed in March, the one you didn't read because you were, and I'm quoting your own words here, too busy to deal with the boring parts." The car went silent except for the wipers dragging uselessly across a windshield that had stopped needing them minutes ago. Julian felt something cold settle low in his stomach, the particular dread of a man realizing the trap had been built with materials he himself had personally supplied. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence, thinned out into something closer to a question. "I would have known." "You would have," his attorney said, "if you'd read anything you signed in the last 2 years instead of handing it all to her to manage while you focused on the shipping deal." Meanwhile, 30,000 feet above him, Camille accepted a glass of something amber and expensive from Ryu, who was watching her with the quiet appraisal of a man reevaluating exactly how much he'd underestimated the woman across from him too. "You knew about the financing restructure 11 days before he handed you those papers," Ryu said slowly. "Which means you knew this was coming." "I suspected," Camille said. Julian isn't subtle. He stopped hiding his phone screen the way careful men hide things. He started hiding it the way guilty men hide things, defensive, jumpy, overcorrecting. "I've negotiated with enough executives to recognize the tells. I just didn't know it would be my birthday." That part, she added, taking a slow sip, was a nice touch. Very on brand for him. Below, in a parking lot that suddenly felt much colder than the weather accounted for, Julian sat frozen in his car, staring at a phone that had just delivered the second gut punch of the night, unaware that a third, considerably larger one, was already boarding a connecting flight from New York, carrying a woman named Priya, who had just discovered, via a very public LinkedIn announcement about Halcyon Pacific's new business partnership, exactly whose name was now attached to the deal that was supposed to fund her entire future. If you've ever watched Karma take its time getting dressed before finally showing up fashionably late but perfectly on cue, You already know what's coming for Julian next. Comment below if you think Priya deserves a warning call, or if you think she's about to learn the same lesson the hard way. Only people who've never rooted for a well-timed reckoning will scroll past without weighing in. Julian, for his part, did the only thing left available to a man whose entire architecture of control had just been quietly, methodically dismantled by two women he'd never bothered to take seriously. He started the car and drove straight toward the one place he was certain he could still fix things. Home. The house was dark when Julian pulled into the driveway, porch light flickering against a steady drizzle that had settled into the kind of patient rain that seems to know exactly how long it plans to stay. He sat in the car for a long moment, hands still on the wheel, running through excuses the way other men rehearsed apologies, except Julian had never quite learned the difference between the two. Inside, he poured himself a drink he didn't taste and pulled out his laptop, some desperate instinct telling him that if he could just get ahead of the financing situation before morning, he could still salvage the deal, even if the marriage was already sinking beneath him like ballast he'd cut loose too eagerly. That was when his phone rang.
Priya.
He almost didn't answer. Some small, cowardly part of him wanted to let it ring out, to postpone one more collision in a night already littered with them. But habit won, the way it usually did with Julian, and he picked up. Her voice, when it came, was not soft. It was not the voice of a woman calling to check in on her secret boyfriend after a long day. It was sharp, clipped, the voice of someone who had just read something on the internet she was not supposed to have read. Halcyon Pacific, Priya said, no greeting, no preamble. You told me you were closing a shipping deal with an anonymous investor. You didn't tell me the investor was your wife's new business partner. You didn't tell me your wife was a business partner at all, Julian. What exactly have you been telling me for the last 8 months? Julian closed his eyes. I can explain, he said, which was, as far as opening lines went, doing an enormous amount of work it could not possibly support. Explain how the apartment lease I signed is now sitting on financing you don't actually control anymore, Priya said. Explain how the wedding venue deposit I put down is tied to money that might not exist by the time we need it. Explain how you convinced me you were a man in control of his life, when you can't even control who's standing on the tarmac when you try to hand your wife divorce papers. You saw that, Julian said, voice flattening with dawning horror. Everyone saw that, Priya said. It's already circulating. Someone at the airfield filmed it. You're not just losing your marriage, Julian. You're losing it publicly, in high definition, while the woman you left is boarding a private jet with a man who apparently owns half the shipping routes on the East Coast. The call ended before Julian could respond, the silence afterwards somehow louder than anything Priya had said. He set the phone down slowly, the way a man sets down something he suspects is about to explode regardless of how gently he handles it, and reached instead for his laptop, hands trembling slightly as he pulled up the video Priya had mentioned. There it was. Grainy, shot from a distance, clearly filmed by someone waiting for a private flight of their own, but unmistakable. Julian on the tarmac, reaching for the envelope. Camille, calm, composed, holding it just out of reach. Ryu descending the stairs like something out of a story people would tell each other at parties for years. The caption beneath it, already gathering comments by the hundreds, read simply, "Man gives wife divorce papers as a birthday gift, gets humbled in real time." Julian scrolled through the comments with the particular masochism of a man who already knows the verdict and reads it anyway. Words like pathetic and clown and she deserves better scrolled past faster than he could process them, each one landing somewhere just beneath his ribs. 30,000 feet above him, Camille's phone buzzed with a message from her sister. A single link and 3 words.
Girl.
You're everywhere. Camille glanced at the video, watched herself on that tarmac one more time, envelope in hand, rain in her hair, and felt something unexpected settle over her. Not embarrassment, not vindication, exactly either. Something steadier than both. Relief, Ryu observed, watching her face. Something like that, Camille said, setting the phone down. Turns out being humiliated on your birthday is a lot easier to survive when the whole internet agrees you didn't deserve it. Below them, in a house that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet, Julian closed the laptop, poured a second drink he wouldn't taste either, and understood, finally and completely, that the story of his birthday gift had stopped being his to control the moment he decided to hand it over. Morning arrived in New York the way it always did, indifferent to the wreckage of the night before, sunlight cutting clean lines across the floor of Ryu's downtown office, as Camille sat across from a conference table full of people who, 48 hours earlier, would not have recognized her name. The financing call had gone better than she'd allowed herself to hope. Halcyon Pacific's board had reviewed the restructured terms, listened to Ryu's brief and pointed explanation of why the original deal, the one tied to Julian's now frozen accounts, no longer met their risk tolerance, and voted unanimously to move forward instead with a new arrangement. One that ran through Camille's consulting firm. One that, as of 9 that morning, made her the primary point of contact for a shipping partnership worth considerably more than the modest life Julian had once told her she should be grateful for. She still hadn't slept, not really, but exhaustion had a different texture now, the good kind, the kind that comes from finally putting down something heavy instead of carrying it quietly for 10 more years. Her phone had not stopped buzzing since sunrise. The tarmac video had climbed past 2 million views overnight, picked up by 3 separate gossip accounts and one morning talk show segment that used the word audacity so many times Camille had started keeping count for fun. Comments continued flooding in, most of them some variation of the same sentiment: disbelief that a man could hand his wife divorce papers over breakfast and expect anything resembling a quiet, tidy ending. If you've made it this far, here's the question worth sitting with. Julian believed control meant never being surprised. Camille proved that real power is knowing exactly when to let someone believe they're winning. Comment below which one of them you'd rather be in a boardroom with, because only people who've never respected a quiet strategist will scroll past without answering. Back in Atlanta, Julian was learning, in real time and in front of an audience he hadn't consented to, exactly how expensive audacity could get. His attorney called at 9:15, voice clipped with a particular strain of a man delivering news he wished someone else had drawn the short straw for. "The shipping deal's dead," he said. "Halcyon pulled out of the original financing entirely. They've restructured through a different entity." Julian, sitting at his kitchen table in the same suit he'd worn the day before, having apparently not found the energy to change it, felt his stomach drop through the floor. What entity? He asked, though some exhausted, defeated part of him already suspected the answer. Reyes Consulting, his attorney said. "Julian, I don't know how to say this gently, that's Camille's firm." Julian let out a laugh that had no humor anywhere inside it, brittle and short, the sound of a man watching the last piece of a very expensive puzzle click into a picture he never wanted to see completed.
"Of course it is," he said.
"There's more," his attorney continued, and Julian closed his eyes because there was always more lately. That was the entire shape of his life now. The board also flagged some irregularities in how the original loan was structured, specifically the collateral you used. "Julian, you used equity from the house. Jointly owned equity, which means Camille's signature was required on that paperwork." "I forged," Julian started, then stopped himself too late. The words already out, already recorded, already sitting in the air between them like something that couldn't be pulled back into his mouth no matter how badly he wanted it there. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that Julian could hear his own heartbeat in it. "I'm going to need you to not say that sentence again to anyone, ever," his attorney said finally, very carefully. "Including me. Especially me." Julian pressed his palm against his forehead, the same gesture the internet had already immortalized in a dozen memes overnight, a gesture that had somehow become shorthand for an entire category of men who confused confidence with competence right up until the moment reality corrected them. Priya hadn't called again. He'd tried her twice, both times sent straight to voicemail. The second attempt met instead with a single text message that read, in full, "The venue called. Deposit's been refunded. Guess we're not doing this. Don't call me again, Julian." He sat with that for a long time, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of a refrigerator that had, until recently, belonged to 2 people instead of one deeply humbled man learning the true cost of a birthday gift he'd thought would simplify his life. By early afternoon, Camille was back in Atlanta, not at the house. She had no interest in setting foot there again until the paperwork made it unambiguously, legally hers, but at Odalise Ferreira's office, signing documents that would do more than end a marriage. They would formally separate every account, every asset, every carefully hidden thread Julian had spent 2 years weaving without ever imagining his wife might one day pull all of it loose at once. The forged signature discovery changes things considerably, Odalise said, sliding a folder across the desk. This isn't just a divorce anymore, Camille. Depending on how you want to proceed, this could be fraud. Property fraud, specifically, given the house equity was used without your consent. Camille studied the folder for a long moment, thinking of 10 years of quiet compromises, of birthdays spent decorating dinners for men who never once decorated anything for her in return, of a marriage she had genuinely tried to save right up until the moment she'd opened an envelope over orange juice and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that saving it had never actually been an option she'd been offered. I don't want him in prison, Camille said finally. I want him humbled. There's a difference, and I think the internet's already started that part for me. Odalise smiled, the particular smile of a lawyer who respected restraint precisely because she'd seen so little of it. Then we'll draft the settlement to reflect that, she said. Full custody of the consulting firm's assets, the house sold with proceeds split according to actual contribution rather than whatever fiction he's been telling himself, and a formal statement on record regarding the forged signature, filed but not pursued, contingent on full compliance. Contingent on him never trying anything clever again, Camille clarified. Contingent on that, Odalise agreed. That evening, Camille sat by the window of the hotel Ryu had arranged for her, watching the city lights flicker on one by one, and allowed herself, for the first time in what felt like years, to simply exhale. Somewhere across town, Julian sat alone in a house that no longer felt like his, staring at a signed settlement he hadn't yet found the courage to sign, finally understanding that the woman he'd once dismissed as too busy, too soft, too simple to notice, had been the only person in the marriage paying attention the entire time. 3 weeks had passed since the tarmac, and Julian Hale had learned more about consequences in 21 days than he had in the previous 39 years of his life combined. The settlement sat on his desk for 6 of those days before he signed it, not out of hope that delay might change anything, but out of the particular denial men like Julian mistake for strategy, the belief that if you simply refuse to acknowledge a door has closed, it might reconsider and swing back open. It did not. The shipping deal was gone, folded permanently into Camille's consulting firm's new partnership with Halcyon Pacific. The house, once his proudest possession, the physical proof that he had built something solid and respectable, sold within 11 days for a sum that, once split according to actual contribution rather than whatever version of history Julian had been telling himself, left him with considerably less than he'd assumed a decade of marriage had entitled him to. Priya never called again. The wedding venue deposit, refunded weeks earlier, had apparently funded a very different trip, one Julian discovered only because a mutual acquaintance mentioned, with the specific cruelty people reserve for men who've become punchlines, that she'd been spotted in Lisbon with someone whose name Julian didn't recognize and had no intention of learning. He signed the settlement on a Tuesday, alone in a rented apartment considerably smaller than the house he'd once alphabetized his liquor cabinet in, and felt, for the first time since the airfield, something that wasn't quite regret but lived in the same neighborhood as it. Not regret for losing Camille, exactly. Regret for never once, in 10 years, bothering to find out who she actually was before deciding he already knew. Camille, meanwhile, was learning what it felt like to build something entirely on her own terms and finding, somewhat to her surprise, that she liked the shape of it considerably more than she'd expected to. Reyes Consulting had grown faster than she or Ryu had projected, buoyed partly by genuine strategy and partly, she suspected with some amusement, by the several million people who'd watched a grainy tarmac video and decided they wanted to root for whoever the woman in the black dress turned out to be. She'd stopped reading the comments after the first week, not out of discomfort, but because she no longer needed strangers on the internet to confirm what she'd already proven to herself in real time, on wet concrete, in the rain, holding an unsigned envelope like a woman who finally understood her own worth had never actually been in question. Ryu had become, somewhat unexpectedly, a genuine friend, the kind who called to check on her progress without an agenda attached, who never once made her feel like a project to be managed or a wound to be fixed. There was something else there too, something neither of them had rushed to name. A quiet ease that had grown slowly across boardrooms and late dinners discussing shipping routes that somehow always ended up discussing everything except shipping routes. Camille wasn't in any hurry to define it. She'd spent 10 years rushing to define herself according to someone else's timeline, and she found she was in no particular hurry to do that again for anyone, even someone as patient and unbothered as Ryu Taehyun. If you've ever needed proof that walking away with your dignity intact beats staying somewhere you're only tolerated, Camille's story is that proof. And if you believe every woman deserves a Ryu showing up on her worst night instead of another Julian showing up with an envelope, you already know what to do before you scroll past this video. The final piece of the story, the one that made the rounds online almost as widely as the original video, happened at an industry gala 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, an event Camille attended not because she needed the validation, but because Reyes Consulting had been formally invited as a rising player in logistics finance, an irony she found considerably more satisfying than she'd expected. Julian was there too, invited as a +1 by a former colleague who clearly hadn't checked the guest list closely enough, and the two of them ended up, against every reasonable odds, standing near the same drinks table at the same moment, the kind of coincidence that only ever happens in stories people don't quite believe until they've lived through one themselves. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way people look smaller once you've stopped needing their approval to feel like yourself. "Camille," he said, and there was none of the old certainty in it, none of the man who'd once handed her an envelope over orange juice and called it simple. "Julian," she said, even and unbothered, the way you greet whether you've already dressed appropriately for. "I saw the news about the partnership," he said. "Congratulations. I mean that." Camille studied him for a moment, searching for the anger she'd expected to feel and finding, instead, only a distant sort of peace, the specific and hard-won peace of a woman who had built an entire new life out of the wreckage a man had assumed would break her. "I know you do," she said, "and I appreciate it, but I don't need it anymore, Julian. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. I don't need you to see my worth. I already do." She didn't wait for a response, didn't need one, and turned instead toward Ryu, who was crossing the room with 2 glasses of champagne and the kind of easy smile that had nothing to prove to anyone, least of all a man standing alone by a drinks table, finally and completely understanding the size of what he'd thrown away. Later that night, standing on a different balcony than the tarmac where this had all begun, Camille looked out over a city that had watched her humiliation and her rise with equal enthusiasm and thought about the question she'd asked Julian on her birthday, the one that had started everything. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" She'd asked it of Julian that morning, but standing here now, glass in hand, city lights spread out beneath her like a promise she'd finally kept to herself, Camille understood she'd actually been asking it of herself the entire time, and for the first time in 10 years, the answer was an easy, unshakable, completely certain yes.